Okay, so today we're going to start demonstration number 3. So we'll be looking at project-specific work today. Primarily, we'll be starting off with looking at lights inside of Blender. We'll also be looking at how to work with the 3D camera, as well as how to add surface materials to a given mesh or form and apply a texture to the surface. So we'll be looking at each of those. Again, when you're working along with the demonstration for the texture part, it doesn't hurt to have a photographic image to play with while we go through that part of the demo. So the first things that we're going to establish here, first off, we're going to take a look at lights inside of Blender. So what I want to highlight here is that if you look in the Blender interface when you open it up, you should notice a little black circle with some little dash lines around it inside your scene. That little guy inside there represents your 3D light source, or in this case it represents the standard default lamp in the scene. And if you select that, just so we're aware of it, that's where it is. You can also look in your outliner panel over in the upper right corner of your scene and locate the lamp in that list. And you will see, if you click on it, that is your 3D light source. Now to preview what lights are actually doing in your scene, the standard shading mode that we're working in right now, which is solid shading, does not preview lights at all. To switch that, we need to go down to our 3D menu down below, and we are going to click on the sphere, the white sphere icon, and these are your shaders, okay? So they're screen preview displays. Go up to Material, and you should see instantly a change in effect on your object. It should have a shadowed side maybe, but now if you move your light source around your scene, you should see a change in effect. So remember, if you don't recall how to move stuff around in Blender, first off, you can use the little on-screen widget that's attached to your selected object. That's that little 3D axis that's blue, green, and red arrowed. And you can click on the arrows directly, or you can click inside the widget, inside the white circle of the widget to sort of freely move it around on two axes. But notice as you move it around that it changes the effect of the light source on the object. So it's giving you a fairly accurate perspective of how light affects the form inside the scene. Yeah?
I was dragging it around and my light source disappeared. Like the cube is completely blank.
Okay, so you were dragging around and it went somewhere off screen?
Yeah.
Period. Okay, if you want to change it, like bring it back to reality. Hopefully it didn't just like glitch on you. But go to your, there's a panel on screen here called Properties on the right. And what I want you to do is go in there and click on the orange cube icon. And then look what it lists for location. And you can drag those back to 0 and it will bring your light back to the origin point of the scene, which is the center of the ground plane. So if it ever does kind of get lost like completely for one reason or another, that's one way to bring it back, is to change each of those location values back to 0. And it'll put it at the center of your ground plane. And then you can just move it after that. And again, that's just working inside the object properties if you lose something. So, so here's what we're going to do. So that's your light source. Now, a couple things besides maneuvering the light around. Let's go ahead and switch to quad view for more accurate control of the light. So if you don't remember how to flip it into quad view, you can do it a couple ways. You can go down to the view menu option down below for your 3D menu and click on view and then select toggle quad view. Again, to get to that, you go to the menu that is associated with the 3D area, and it's this one right here. This is the one confusing factor in Blender. when you open it initially is that there's a 3D view tab and then there's a timeline tab directly below it that has its own menu. And that can get a little confusing. So the 3D one is denoted by this little gray cube icon right here, and it's that strip of options. So go to View, Toggle Quad. You can also turn on Quad View by pushing Control-Alt-Q, and that'll turn it off and on. But now you can kind of understand, like when you move your things around or move an object around like a light, this gives you, again, more accurate control besides manipulating it in a user perspective, which is really hard for precision, is to use the other views to coordinate movement. So if you move it in one space, it's going to show you relative positioning in the other 3 views. My workflow typically when I'm repositioning objects in 3D space is I work from the top view. And you'll notice that each quad view is labeled in the corner. But I usually work from the top view to move around an object, and then I move in the other views to reposition it accordingly in terms of being like an up and down or left and right position. All right, so let's do this. Let's add a couple extra lights to the scene now. So does anybody remember how we add extra things into the scene?
Possibly the add button.
Good job. Add. What else? One more.
Lamp.
Create. Yay. And create is the one that's in your tool shelf on the left side of the screen. It's a tab that says create. So look over on the left for that left-hand toolbar and find the one that says create. And you can go down and you can find your different lamps. So let's add a couple more point lights to the scene. And as you drop them in, you'll notice they drop them at the 0 point. Just move them out from there. They will always drop them at the center of the screen when you add a new object. But drop it in, grab the widget, and move it around.
What do you mean in the center? Like,
when you add new objects in Blender, they always appear at the 0 origin point, which is the crisscross intersection of the grid plane on screen.
I see.
So every time you drop one in, that's where it goes first. But drag them away from there, otherwise they're just going to all sit in the same spot.
And in my cube, if my cube is there.
Yeah, and inside your cube, if your cube is centered on screen. Move them away from the center by grabbing the widget and clicking inside the little white circle for the selected widget. And move them around. Use the different views to raise the lights up off of the ground plane area relative to your object, so they kind of sit above your object.
I got a sun.
And this is a quick way just to get a few lights in scene. Any standard lighting setups usually have about 3 lights. A fill light, a key light, and some sort of back or rim lighting to help kind of shape and form something. So we're just going to have 3 out here to play with for the exercise. And once you've got them out there, we're going to look at the actual light properties. So go across the screen to the right and look at your properties panel. Properties, again, is this panel that rests right below your outliner viewport area. And it's got a little strip of icons. And there's one icon in there that looks like a yellow dot kind of sun with little arrows extending out of the center. That's this little guy nestled right next to this little red and white checkerboard icon. And that is your light properties icon. So click on that. And by the way, you only see that if you have a light selected. It won't be available otherwise. Most things in Blender are context sensitive to the objects you have active. All right, so once you turn that on, let's talk about light properties. Number one, what it shows you here is it gives you a preview up against a flat surface of the quality of your light source, what it will do. So it kind of shows like a shaded region and a highlighted area. The type of light that we are using is listed below that where it says lamp, and it says point light or point. A point light is basically, it acts just like a light bulb. It lights in all directions from a single point. What's also interesting to note about point lights is that they have what's called fall off. Fall off is what basically happens with light naturally. Over distance, it fades out in energy. So you get less and less light as you move away from its center. So we can actually control that with a point light. Now, if you ever want to convert one of your lights to a different light source at any point, you can click on these other respective buttons here that say sun or spot or Hemi or area. And that will convert whatever selected light source you're currently working with. Now let me kind of talk about these individually, some of them. Besides point light, you have access to other ones like a sun. You can drop in kind of harsh directional light, continuous light source into your scene. So if you preview that in your scene, you'll notice that it looks like a little sort of light depiction of a sun sort of icon, and then it has a light line that extends from it. So the line just indicates the direction of light. If you ever want to change that direction that the sun is aimed in, you can use your rotation for your object to rotate it. A couple ways that you can rotate if you don't recall. You can hit the R key in whatever respective window your mouse is located in, and that will activate the basic rotate for your object. You can also hit R again to use free rotation, and then you can twist and turn the thing in any direction you want. Again, it doesn't matter where the sun is positioned in the scene because it's continuous light or infinite light, but it does matter the direction of it. So it's kind of fun to work with if you need a harsh directional source. I recommend working from like the top view and just using the sort of flexibility of the full rotate feature by hitting R twice, so it shows like a red and green arrow set. And then you can move it around and pretty much push it in any direction that you want it to aim in. All right, so that's the sun. I also want to point out the spotlight feature. The spotlight, this is basically this light source does exactly what a stage light will do. So it's a controlled light source. So it only projects light through a circular form. You can change the shape of it. We'll talk about it in a minute. But it is so you know that you have a controlled light source that you can recreate inside of your scene, as opposed to just like a broad open omni light that shoots in all directions, like the point. The other two lights are a little bit harder to control, and I don't recommend just playing with them. The Hemi light evenly lights the entire scene with 180 degrees of light, so it's really more like for a previewing tool. A lot of people use it when they're previewing like a CAD developed image or something for industrial design where you want to see all components of the object, but we don't need that. Again, you're using light to help shape your sculpture and give it some atmosphere and give it a little drama to help us understand it. Now let's do this. Now that we've got some lights to play with out in the scene, let's also add some extra objects. So I'm going to go ahead and add a few things to my scene. Again, you can use Create or the Add menu button from the 3D menu down below. I'm going to add the monkey. This is our Blender Suzanne object. And I'm going to add a sphere. And maybe I'll add one more object just for fun. I'll add the cone. And kind of play around with their positioning inside the environment. Again, kind of get your hands dirty with playing with the manipulation tools for navigating objects around. Resize them if you want. Some key things to remember for manipulating like scale, rotation, or movement. You can gain access to any of those, by the way, from that tool shelf panel on the left side of the screen by using the Tool tab. And you have transformations up at the top that you can use, like translate, which is just a fancy word for move, rotate, and scale. And those are kind of free form from up there. You can also use your widget on screen to do it. Interesting thing to note in Blender, if you get the error where you are using your widget and it suddenly no longer works for some reason, it could be because you've clicked on this small button down here at the base by the axis controls on the 3D bar. This little double-sided white arrow with 3 little blue dots right above it controls whether or not you're able to move or manipulate a widget from its center. And if you turn that on, this little icon right here, it will disengage certain effects of the widget. So I can't even rotate my object right now. And I probably can't scale it. Yep. So if you don't want that to happen, you need to turn this feature off. Often it gets turned on by accident. So just so you're aware, that feature is there. And can be a hang-up early on if you're just experimenting with the software. All right, so got some objects in there. Okay. Again, now we can kind of move around our lights to kind of preview them over all of our objects. Let's go ahead and hover one of our light sources over the top so that we can convert it into a spotlight. So move one of your lights over kind of the overhead of your sculptural kind of scene you're working with. Make sure it's positioned above it and not inside an object, right? And let's convert that light that we have on in the properties, let's convert it to a spotlight. And you should notice on screen the effect of the spot. Again, for manipulating your views and moving around and navigating on screen, you can use plus or minus on your number pad to zoom in and out based on where the window that your mouse is located in. You can also use the rest of your number pad to navigate around your user perspective window to rotate around your scene by using 4 or 6 to rotate or orbit left and right. And then you can use 8 and 2 to rotate up and down. But again, remember that's on the number pad. If you click those numbers on your normal keyboard, that will actually switch between layers on Blender, which inevitably makes everything disappear. So be careful with that. You're actually working right now in layer number 1 in case you ever accidentally hit one of those keyboard ones or numbers across the top of your keyboard. All right, so see the effect of the spotlight. Move it around in your top view until it actually overlaps different pieces of your objects so you can see the effect of the spot actually occur in your scene. It's probably at this point it'd be good to kind of talk about the different properties you can manipulate for your light and how to do that. So we'll start with this spotlight. So again, make sure you can see it over the top of your objects in some way, or the edge of it as well. And let's go over to our properties and let's look at the properties we can manipulate for a spot. So first off, every light comes with the ability to change its color. Over here in the properties panel, you have a long white strip inside there. Click on that white strip for the lamp property, and you should get a pop-up for a color guide, so you can actually pick out the color that your light emits. So if you don't want it to just be standard white, you could switch it to a completely different tone. Now, keep in mind that the further you push that color selection towards the outskirts of the circle, the higher the influence the color has over the object's base colors. But the closer you keep it to the center, the more faded out the light energy is for that color. So pick a color and kind of play around. Like I would say, see if you can set all your lights to something different in your scene real fast. So go to each light and give it a different tone to play with. And you should have kind of a wild, kind of multicolored scene of some kind, sort of working. And so every light can have a color applied. Well, you can also control how much power it has by adjusting this value that says energy. energy, as you change that, again, we'll change up the amplification of the light source to make it a more high-powered light. So feel free to kind of make adjustments to each of your light sources to see how that affects your scene.
It's like music video lighting.
Yes, it is. So you can get some very stylized lighting effects pretty quick in here. It's also, when you're learning how to light, if you don't have physical lights, this is actually, like 3D software actually is a great tool for simulation to understand what your lighting setup is going to do in reality. But fun to play with. So energy controls, again, what it says, the power level or intensity of the light. There's your fall off option that you can control down below. So it says fall off. It gives you like the ability to change how it reads it, like inverse square versus constant. And then it gives you the distance that the light will fall off at. If you shrink that, it'll back up the cone for your spotlight. Or in the case of your, where's the other lights? The point light. It just changes up the quality of light at the distance that it is. So the further the distance, the more powerful the light is. And the shorter the distance, the least powerful the light is. That means it has to be much, much closer to your object that it's projecting on. All right, let's slide down the property bar here for lights, and let's look at some other properties. Go back to your spotlight if you're not already. And another standard you're going to have with all lights is the ability to control shadow output. So you can actually control the quality of shadows that are casted with this light. You can use no shadows if you don't want it to do anything. You can use buffer, which is okay, and then you can use ray shadows, which is supposed to produce more realistic shadow rendition on screen. And so you can change the softness of the shadow by using soft size. You can also change the quality of it by upping the number of samples to reproduce a more accurate looking shadow. Now keep in mind, the more you amp that stuff up, the more it can potentially take on the computer, more heavy toll it takes on the machine. Go a little further down past shadows and you've got a setting specifically for spot shape. So in here we can actually change the quality of our spotlight in our scene. So there's one here that says size. So you can either make it a broad spotlight or a very narrow one. So as I change the slider, it makes it very broad if I go really big or really tiny. And it's all based on degrees of the circle itself or degrees of the cone shape. You can also change the shape of it to a square if you want to. So it doesn't have to be a circular form, but you can actually have it project the light through a square shape instead. You can also turn on the visualization of the cone if you turn on show cone. That way you can actually see when you have the spotlight turned on how the shape or outline of the cone is affecting the environment, so where the light's being cast. Sometimes it's helpful. You don't have to have that on though. But those are some specific settings you'd have for your spotlight. Point light does not have that many settings. Again, it just has shadow control and basic lamp settings. And again, as you work with the tool in the environment, manipulate the lights, position them, work with them to get the effect that you want out of your scene, putting them close or near or far. If you want to render your scene in kind of a higher quality render, you can also switch that shader option at the bottom of your 3D menu, where it's probably an orange sphere right now. And you can switch that to where it says rendered. And that will give you a sort of temporary on-screen preview or low-level preview of what your final output will look like. So to find that, it's down here at the bottom of your 3D menu. And if you see where object mode is, go over to this sphere and click on this, because these are your shader display options. And you can change that to rendered to see rendered. But when you're done in rendered, just to preview it, always take it back out to like material or solid mode, because you can't do a whole lot of editing in render mode. All right. So the next thing that I want to point out, and then we'll take a break, is I want to look at the camera, and this is only going to take a minute to look at it, but to understand how Blender renders out like still images from the system is all based on where the camera is looking inside your scene. And every Blender scene comes with a standard 3D camera. To know what the 3D camera is in your scene, again, make sure you're in like, for your display shader mode, make sure you're like in material or solid so you can see where it's located. You can locate it in your outliner panel first by looking for where it says camera over there in the upper left, upper right.
Directions.
And click on camera, and it should highlight it in your scene. It looks like a pyramid with a little triangular solid shape above it. And that is your camera object in your scene. Whatever the camera sees is what gets rendered. So if we want to switch to the camera perspective, we can do it one of two ways. We can hit 0 on our number pad, and that will flip your user perspective. Now, when you do that, by the way, make sure your arrow is located inside of one of your viewports, and then hit 0. If you don't, Blender won't read your shortcut, because that's a view shortcut button. But you can hit 0 to open or convert your user view to a camera perspective view. Or you can also go down to your view from your 3D menu, go to cameras, and then go to active camera. And it will do the same thing. You can always disengage the camera by hitting 0 again, just so you're aware. But what you see through the camera is what you will get when you send out a static image. If you don't see anything, this is where we play the game of repositioning the camera and getting it aimed at our environment. So number one, again, like this is my thing, but I usually identify my camera in my top view perspective. So you can zoom in or out on that view by using either your mouse roll wheel or plus or minus on the number pad. And when you see your camera located in that view, go ahead and move it around some to where it's aimed, at least to where it's aimed at your objects. Remember, you can also rotate this. So I would to rotate it, I would just hit R so that it keeps the rotation angle constrained until you get your camera to look at your object, or mostly at it, hopefully, or partially. Again, notice that as you move the rotation around, that your user perspective window changes accordingly. But yeah, reposition the camera in each of your different viewports until you get a good angle on all of your objects, and to where you can see everything. Again, it's a coordinated effort because you're moving in 3D perspective. Once you've got everything, now here's another thing to notice. If you zoomed in on accident into your 3D camera perspective window, you can always zoom back out by, again, using Command plus or minus to do that. Yeah.
How did you get, because mine still says user perspective, how did you get to the
Yeah, so to change it, make sure your mouse, again, is located out in your viewing windows. And then you can hit 0 to convert your user perspective to the camera. Yeah. Again, Blender is very sensitive about where your mouse is. For view changing, you have to have your mouse out over the viewports. Otherwise, it won't read your shortcuts. All right, so now that we've got it located there, now we can actually work with the camera a little bit more effectively. Go to your Properties panel and go ahead and click on the little film camera icon, the cinema camera icon in your Property panel. So it's over there next to your checker box. And this will pull up all of your properties available for your 3D camera. Now, we're not going to go in depth with how to control the camera today as much as just how to get it to move around and aim it at something in your scene for the sake of previewing only. So when we pull up the camera properties, there's a few things I want to note. Number one, you can change the effect of the lens on the scene. So it gives you the option to switch between what's called perspective view or orthographic. Perspective gives you image distortion or natural distortion like a lens would. So there's a vanishing point system, which is controlled by a slider or a value system down below by the focal length of the lens. So the smaller the focal length, the wider the scene is. The larger it is, the more telephoto or squish the scene will appear. If you switch to orthographic, orthographic basically takes all perspective distortion out of the camera. So it makes more of what looks like isometric type design or perspective. So the objects don't shrink in the distance like they would normally with a normal lens. To control that, you use orthographic scale. The orthographic scale slider right below it in the camera property. An interesting thing to know with the orthographic camera is that if you move that camera around in your scene, you can't push the camera closer to the objects to make it zoom in because it's not controlled by distance distortion. You can move it around it and rotate it however you want, but the objects won't be distorted or shown with distance when you have that on. All right. Also, one other thing to know, if you ever want to render out a quick still image of the scene, just to kind of see a preview of it from the camera perspective, switch to your render icon under properties, which looks like a little still camera. That's the first little icon under there. This little guy. Click on that. Go down to where it says display under render. Switch it from image editor to new window. So from image editor, switch it to new window, and then hit the render button right there next to it. And you may have to zoom in or zoom out on your scene, but that will generate a full kind of on-screen preview based on the current settings of what your scene is going to look like when it outputs from Blender. So it gives you the effect of the lights, the effect of shadows, and anything else you've currently added to the scene.
Isn't that what render does too, though?
No. What regular, like are you talking about the shader or the shading, the viewing option?
Yes.
It previews it. Now it uses a lower resolution to preview it typically, but it won't allow you to save that image out to use separately from the system. But that's what this allows you to do. Now when you're done in this viewport, guys, you can close it up at the top and hit the X. Because again, that's why I had you change it to like a new window. If you don't do that, this is what it does instead. It leaves it on image editor by default, and when you hit render, it overtakes your 3D screen. And to switch it back, you have to go down to this icon where your 3D menu icon used to be. And it looks probably like a little sunset image right now. You click on that and switch it to 3D view. And that'll open your 3D views back up. Okay. So that's, in a nutshell for now, that's how you can work with your camera to get kind of a quick, larger screen render of your image to preview as you go. Again, for testing of lighting and shadows and those types of things in your scene. We'll go ahead and stop this part of the demo right here. And then we'll pick up and talk about working with creating materials and applying textures in the next part of the demo.
Sweet.